Merchant Marines. The Merchant Marines were a fleet of ships controlled by civilian sailors that transported imports and exports that consisted of food, oil, weapons, and other munitions. Canada created their personal Merchant Marine Navy for the war effort during World War II. Within hours of Canada's declaration of war on September 10, 1939, the Canadian government passed laws to create the Canadian Merchant Navy, setting out rules to provide a workforce for wartime shipping. The World War II Merchant Navy expanded a similar effort in World War I, known as the Canadian Mercantile Marine. The Canadian Merchant Marines played a significant role in the Battle of the Atlantic, contributing to the Allies' merchant fleet due to high losses in the British Merchant Navy. A school was established at St. Margaret's Bay, Nova Scotia, to train sailors for the Canadian Merchant Navy. Manning barracks were built in major Canadian ports so that merchant marines in training would have places to stay. Considered a fourth branch of the Canadian military after the Royal Canadian Navy, Canadian Army, and the Royal Canadian Air Force, the Canadian Merchant Marines suffered the highest casualty rate of the four services. Because they were civilians, they received no awards or recognition, wore no uniforms, worked in no organized force, and yet they are known to be the real heroes of the Atlantic, because they are regular civilians who endured the impossible. The sailors of the Merchant Marines were divided into two main categories: deck officers and unlicensed crew members. Deck officers were responsible for the sufficient function of the ship, such as navigation and engineering, as well as supervising the crew. People who were assigned to these specific roles were usually graduate of the Merchant Marine Academy. The unlicensed crew members operated deck machinery, handled maintenance, cooking, and the sanitation duties. The Canadian Merchant Marines had only 41 ocean-going merchant ships at the beginning of the Second World War. During the war, this fleet expanded because Canadian shipyards produced 403 merchant vessels. Most were taken over by Britain or the United States, but a significant number sailed underneath the Canadian flag. 58 Canadian registered merchant ships were lost to enemy action, and 1,146 Canadian Merchant Marines died at sea or in Axis prison camps. Merchant Marines played a vital role in the Second World War, transporting desperately needed food, equipment, and personnel to Britain and other Allied countries on non-military vessels. Although not part of the armed forces, these men and women faced constant threat from enemy submarines, destroyers, and aircraft seeking to cut off supply lines. The merchant ships weren't built for battle. Therefore, they were presented as a perfect target. Their ponderous bulk couldn't move quickly enough to avoid attackers, and the sailors aboard were aware of this vulnerability, making the intensity on board extremely thick while at sea. Despite these risks, enlistment was high in Newfoundland and Labrador, where thousands of volunteers joined the service before hostilities ended. Many served underneath Newfoundland ships, while others joined the merchant navies of different Allied countries, including Canada, the United States, and Panama, but most served on British ships. Britain relied on imports from North America for its war effort. Any significant interruption of the shipping lanes across the North Atlantic would have likely guaranteed victory for the Germans and defeat for the Allies. Recognizing the importance of merchant marines, the British government sought for Canadian volunteers from Newfoundland and Labrador soon after the hostilities broke out. Alongside the thousands of sailors already serving on commercial vessels, thousands more volunteered after the call went out, specifically 12,000. Most were older men or teenage boys who weren't of age to be accepted to participate in the army. Small numbers of women also joined, usually as stewardesses. When recruited, they usually signed up to partake in only a certain number of voyages, with the possibility of renewal, although if a volunteer wanted to stay ashore, he or she had the right to do as they wished. The largest threat for the Marines came from the German U-boats, which watched shipping lanes in groups and torpedoed passing merchant ships. At the peak of hostilities between late 1942 and early 1943, U-boats sank an average of 33 Allied merchant ships each week. Most losses occurred in the North Atlantic, but Axis forces sunk many merchant ships off the coast of South America and Africa. Unable to replace destroyed ships quickly enough, Britain ordered that every available ship was to be redeemed and put into service, some of which were extremely old. This presented another danger for merchant mariners, who now had to serve on ships that had already been titled unable to serve at sea. Of all the battles of World War II, Churchill stated that his main concern was the U-boat threat, because merchant ships that were carrying oil were a major target of enemy submarines, because they provided the fuel for Allied factories, tanks, automobiles, and airplanes, and Britain didn't produce oil on their own. One of the few ports open throughout the year was a port called Meshkovsk in Russia, making it significant because it was the only way to get supplies to Russian allies. 300 miles from North America and the ocean, on the path towards Britain, merchant mariners had the aid of the Air Force behind them, who scouted the Atlantic in search of enemy submarines. Convoy groups protected the merchant marines due to their importance in the war effort. Instead of going singularly, where they would be easy targets for the enemy, they soon formed groups. This was called convoys. But the German U-boats also had a very dangerous technique. Once the U-boats discovered the merchant marines' location, they signaled to other U-boats so that they could attack together. These groups were called wolf packs. Another strategy that was used was when the merchant marines got closer to Britain, they had come under attack from German long-range aircrafts that were used to prevent them from reaching Britain last minute. After the war, the Canadian merchant marine veterans were denied veterans' benefits and official recognition for decades. Only in the 1990s was this major issue resolved, when the veterans of the merchant marines were granted a status equivalent to that of the RCN veterans in 1992, but many cases remain unresolved. The contribution that the merchant mariners made to the war effort was astronomical, and the bravery that came forth in a time of need will forever be remembered throughout history.